The effects of colonial settlements in Van Diemen's Land on Aboriginal peoples. So we have Hobart Town on the River Derwent by Edwin Duncan. Aboriginal peoples lived in Lutruwita, also known as Tasmania, for at least 35,000 years and possibly up to 50,000 years. As hunter-gatherers, they lived by hunting wild animals such as mutton birds, wallabies, possum, and fish, gathering edible plants such as fern tree roots and parts of the grass tree fronds, and shellfish such as oysters and mussels. They used all parts of their environment, including caves and rocky overhangs for shelter, tree bark and reeds for canoes, and different types of grasses for basket weaving. At the start of the 1800s, there were approximately 4,000 to 10,000 Aboriginal people, in at least 9 separate language groups living there. Each language group had a territory or country for which they were responsible, as shown on the map here, but it is thought that the groups moved all around the island to trade and to access food and other resources based on the seasons. So Tasmania was known as Lutruwita. At the start of the 1800s, approximately 4,000 to 10,000 Aboriginal people lived in at least 9 separate language groups. In 1803, the first European settlement of Tasmania was established at Risdon Cove on the Derwent River. It began as a colonial penal settlement known as Hobart Town, but the settlement rapidly expanded further onto Aboriginal land. Europeans and Aboriginal people began competing for the same resources such as land, water, and animals for food. Within a short space of time, many Aboriginal people died, either as a result of conflict or from introduced diseases. Aboriginal Tasmanians had little or no resistance to common European diseases such as influenza, pneumonia, and tuberculosis. Conflicts also occurred as Aboriginal peoples tried to protect themselves and their lands. By the mid-1820s, British settlement had expanded across Tasmania, with farming and livestock raising reaching even into the By the mid-1820s, British settlement had expanded across Tasmania, with farming and livestock raising reaching even into the central regions. As a result of continued violence between the settlers and the Aboriginal people, the government introduced policies to try to eliminate the so-called Aboriginal problem. The Black War refers to a period of conflict from 1828 to 1832 between British colonists and Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples. When martial law was declared by the government, headed by Lieutenant Governor General George Arthur, Tasmanian Aboriginal peoples when martial law was declared by the government headed by Lieutenant Governor General Arthur. Martial law, which means military control, was declared in the settled areas of Van Diemen's Land in 1828. Soldiers were ordered to shoot or arrest any Aboriginal person found in areas settled by colonists. In 1830, Governor Arthur ordered the removal of the Oyster Bay and Big River peoples from the colonial settlement areas and called on soldiers and armed colonial settlers to form a human chain across Van Diemen's Land, known as the Black Line. Thousands of men swept across the south and east of the island and tried to move Aboriginal peoples to the Tasmanian Peninsula. So this is the Black Line here. And they formed this line here and they pushed the Aboriginal people that lived here and here, they pushed them to the Tasman Peninsula. Pretty mean. Between 1829 and 1834, George Augustus Robinson, called the conciliator and protector of Aborigines in various sources, was commissioned by the colonial government to travel to Tasmania and gather together the Aboriginal people who were still alive. There are mixed views on Robinson's role. Robinson had begun his work from motives of compassion, hoping to help the Aboriginals and improve their conditions. As his plan succeeded, however, he became more interested in financial rewards. By August 1834, the Aboriginal problem as the colonialists, oh my gosh, can't say that word. By 1883, the Aboriginal problem as the colonialists saw it had been settled. By August 1834, the Aboriginal problem as the colonists saw it had been settled, since all but about a dozen Aboriginal people had been removed from the mainland to Flinders settlement. Surviving Aboriginal people were sent to Wyballina, a settlement on Flinders Island and Bass Strait. Wyballina was exposed to the weather, had a limited supply of water and land that was barely suitable for cultivation, so they couldn't grow crops on it. The site was unsuitable as it had a limited water supply and was open to the weather. Little of the land could be cultivated. The removal of Aboriginal peoples from country, the diseases they suffered, and the limited food supplies all had a devastating effect on the Aboriginals at the mission. By 1847, when the site was closed, only 47 Aboriginal people were still alive. So really not a nice place to be. Terrible. In 1847, the 47 survivors of Wyballina were moved to Oyster Cove near Hobart. The deaths continued, however. A few, such as Fanny Cochrane Smith, managed to survive by leaving the reserve. Fanny Cochrane Smith was born on Flinders Island in 1834. Fanny married and left Oyster Cove in 1855. She is known for her recordings of Aboriginal songs, which comprise the only audio recordings of an indigenous Tasmanian language. She died in 1905. Truganini, thought to be born in 1812, is probably the most famous Aboriginal woman, as she was for many years regarded as the last Tasmanian when she died in 1876. Truganini, originally from the Nuanoni group of southeast Tasmania, saw her family and people devastated by the effects of European colonisation, but she continued to work to save her people. Truganini and her father, Mangurner, leader of one of the Nuanoni groups, met George Robinson in 1829 at Bruny Island, and she became associated with his mission around Tasmania. He promised that they would be protected, provided for, and eventually have their lands returned to them. These promises were not kept. It has been more recently recognised that an Aboriginal community, descended from people who had managed to avoid the government's efforts to contain them in the missions, had established itself in the Bass Strait Islands by the end of 1800s. From 1798, ex-convicts or sailors, now working at sealers in Bass Strait, formed a relationship with the Aboriginal people. In the beginning, the Aboriginal people were very cruelly treated, but over time, the sealers married Aboriginal women and settled with their families in the community. Sealing and mutton birding, which were traditional skills of the Aboriginal women, became an important part of the community. Those members of the modern-day descendant community who trace their ancestry to Aboriginal Tasmanians practice many aspects of traditional Tasmanian Aboriginal culture in various parts of the state, including the islands of Bass Strait.